We were given an opportunity to select a charity for this year's Fall Festival. I picked the Navajo Project because I have always had an interest in the strength of the indigenous people, not only through history, but their strength today in 2022. The more I learned about the Navajo Project and its ties to quilting, the more I felt it was a perfect fit for this segment.
After spending about 2 hours with Kari and Susan, the founders of the Navajo Project, we were certain we had made the right choice. We hope their story moves you as much as it has moved us.
My name is Kari Zabala, and I own a company in Los Angeles called French General, and we design fabric and quilts for Moda. We've been with Moda since 2008, and it's been a whirlwind experience for me. I hadn't been introduced to the quilting world before I met Moda, and it's been a really fun ride for me to be one of their designers and to be a part of producing beautiful 18th and 19th century French, very classical reproduction fabric in designs and color. I began the Navajo Quilt Project about 7 years ago. We had been driving through the Navajo Nation, and I noticed that there was a real need for sewing supplies. So I actually met a woman at a trading post, and her and I talked for a while, and she told me that she was a weaver during certain months of the year. And then when it was warmer, she would go outside and weave. And when it was colder, she would come inside and do her quilts. And she said, but her only problem was she just didn't have enough access to fabric. So at that point I had already started designing for Moda, and I said, I got plenty of fabric.
Wow.
So I started sending her fabric, and she just kept saying, keep sending it, keep sending it. I'm giving it to my sister, to my mother, to my brothers, whoever needed some fabric to make quilts or clothing or any sort of decorative items with. And it ran like that for about a year, maybe 6 months. And then one day I was in the Autry Museum out in Los Angeles, and I saw a quilt in the gift shop, and it had Susan Hudson's name on it. And I think it said, Navajo quilter, Susan Hudson. And I thought, what? Like Navajo quilter, Susan Hudson? So I immediately went home and I Googled her name, and, all this information came up about this amazing master quilter in the Navajo Nation that was doing ledger quilts, pictorial quilts. And so I immediately wrote to her and I said, would you ever be interested in helping me with this little project that, this idea that I've had in my head to help bring more fabric and sewing supplies to the Navajo Nation? It took her a little while to respond. She wasn't sure who I was. And eventually she wrote to me and she said, let's do this. Let's partner up and start this project and take it further. And then I was able to take it on my own. And so once I met Susan, that's really when the ball started rolling. And, we've been working together for about 6 years now.
Wow.
And it's been a really wonderful collaboration. We both have different sides to our personality. So, we can kind of bounce off of each other and play off of each other. And we've found that we're a really good team. And I think we've made a difference. We see that, things are changing and women are quilting more and sewing and have access to sewing machines, and lots and lots and lots of fabric. And so we've got goals, of more things we want and need. But right now we have established kind of a ground for the Navajo Quilt Project. And we've got a great base, and we think it'll continue to grow.
So it was in motion for about 6 months, but it really started, so it sounds like it started to get more organized, and it went from idea to reality when Susan
Absolutely.
came on.
Absolutely. So I think when Susan came on, what happened, or what I always like to say is all of a sudden, we had boots on the ground. We had
Yeah.
Right.
somebody
Right.
in the Navajo Nation that was actually, you know, visiting these chapter houses or filling up a truck and donating, 300 pounds of fabric on a Saturday.
Wow.
And then Susan was able to bring in her people. And, so it grew on Susan's side quite quickly, because I think you had enough people, Susan, that really wanted to be a part of something. And it gave all of us kind of this purpose of, oh, we can actually be, getting fabric into the right hands and letting those people create and make something on their own,
Wow.
not having to drive, whatever it might be, 100, 150, 200 miles and go to, find a fabric store. So
Right.
started bringing it to, bringing supplies to the grandmothers, to the sisters and the aunts, and even the brothers, I would say, right, Susan? We have some men quilters now.
That is just so incredible.
So I think after I met Susan, the Navajo project started to truly impact my life. Before that, it was just me working, out of French General and, kind of making a phone call every once in a while to a chapter house or a senior center, trying to get them to take some fabric donations.
Mm-hmm.
Once I met Susan, I think it changed from me trying to, work my way into a very tight community of people.
Right.
And by Susan and I holding hands in this project, I think we're able to achieve more together. And I
Right.
think it changed the direction of the project. And it became much more fulfilling for me because I was able to learn really more about the needs and the wants of the Navajo quilters. And before that, I think I was just trying to fill a need.
Right.
I think with Susan, I started to understand the need. And I think that's been much more meaningful to me and how I've continued to work in the project.
Right.
Because I understand it now. And I don't think I wouldn't have understood it as much without Susan.
Susan, can you introduce yourself to us?
Yate, Susan Hudson Nishle, Ki Ani Nishle, Kini Pashashi, Tabaha Dashate, Nakaidene Shinali. I live in Sheep Springs, New Mexico on the Great Navajo Nation. As a Navajo, we introduce ourselves to each other so we know what our clans are. I like to acknowledge the ancestral cultural land that I am walking upon throughout Mother Earth. And right now I'm on my own traditional lands. So I like to acknowledge my ancestors. And I also like to acknowledge the people in my life that have inspired me, my ancestors, my spirit helpers, and Chukashala. And how I started was my quilting was I was around 9 years old and we were really poor. I mean, we were poor. So people would feel sorry for us and give my mom clothes. And how she learned to sew was in the boarding schools. And so she was she was beaten, and she didn't do things right. So when she taught me how to alter clothes, I would get hit. And finally, years later, I go, Mom. And so then she told me about when she was in the boarding school and what happened to her, all the abuse that she went through. And then that's how she knew. So I decided I wasn't going to teach my kids because I was scared that I was going to do that to them. And I didn't want to discourage them from doing that. And so, the little pieces that were left over, we would make like little quilts out of them, and make them bigger. Um, when I was 13, my great grandmother died, and she had this quilt. When somebody dies in the family, we didn't do wills and stuff, so everybody was fighting over everything. Well, when they brought the quilt out, everybody stopped, and they started talking about all the history of those little pieces of fabric that are in there, the shirts, the pants. And then that's when you start finding out how crazy your family really is. Oh, remember when I did remember that girl that slapped you? You start hearing all these stories. And so that had a really profound effect on me. And I was going, that's our history. That's our stories. All my grandma and all them, they went to boarding schools and stuff. So they were brutally punished, raped and everything else and, beaten. And so my mom didn't teach Navajo because she didn't, she didn't know what the future was going to be. And she didn't want us to go through that. So we learned English and we were forced to learn English so we could assimilate. And we were told during that time not to say we were Navajo, which to basically say we were Mexican, Spanish or Mexican. We were something else other than what we were. We had to decide who we were for so many years. So now I'm like, I'm not going to do that. I'm proud of who I am, and so that's part of my quilting story, my legacy. And so that's why once again, I'll say I'm an activist because I give a voice, I talk for the ones that can't talk. When I do my quilts, I make sure I pray and everything, my spirit helpers, quilt makers, my ancestors, all of them, I pray and ask them that for help and for guidance because they're the ones that it's their story. It's going to be their story. Not only does that, and with the Navajo Quilt Project, not only does it help, provide warmth, for the grandmas to make something for the grandchildren or, something that they need to keep warm but also very important in our culture is our ceremonies. When we have these ceremonies, we're giving a homemade quilt to the medicine people. And people don't realize how emotional that is because then that connects them to their grandparents and their great grandparents that made quilts for them, or when they were little in the Hogan, or going to like Gallup ceremonial or something, on the wagon going up to the chief camp, and you have this quilt, and that there's a story behind that quilt. So that's a really important part of the Navajo Quilt Project is those ceremonies. And so when all these beautiful people send us boxes and, boxes of fabric and needles and everything, and they're sending it out, because it's quite expensive to send this stuff, but with their beautiful hearts sending it, they also become part of that ceremony and they get the blessings that we get. They get the prayers too, and they don't realize that. So I'm glad you're giving me this opportunity to let people know when you do that as part of that ceremony, you get prayers, you get blessings. It comes back to you because you have such a big, beautiful heart. And we really appreciate it because we know a lot of times that, it's really expensive to send us something, but, we appreciate that. And linter art is the Plains Indians are known for it, but I always say we all had our own kind of ledger art. So what I did was I started doing ledger quilts. And what I started doing was giving a voice to my ancestors and a voice to the ones that could not talk. And that's where my activism in quilting started.
Wow.
I didn't want to be one of those little gray haired women with the cardigan sweater. I was going to be out there front. I was going to give voice to them. I was going to tell my story, not have somebody tell me what they thought my story should be. Now I command anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 a quilt.
Wow, good for you. And how amazing is the quilts that the story comes full circle, right? Like the quilts that you're making that money on are the quilts you're honoring your ancestors' stories with. Yeah. That's the quilts that finally, like when you finally fully stepped into your story in your quilting and said, I'm using my quilting skills to honor my grandmother and my ancestors. And in that honoring, like you said, the ceremonies and the blessings, it just comes right back. Like when you step into your story, truly, that's your authentic self. Like that's who we are. That's our authentic self. Yeah. So that's just so incredible. What an amazing story, Susan. Kari, is there anything as far as like what the Navajo Project is today?
So the Navajo Quilt Project gathers fabric, quilting supplies, and finished quilts to donate to women that live on the Navajo Nation. We also collect monetary donations and use it to purchase scissors, thread, batting, needles, so that the women can quilt in the winter and make beautiful warm blankets for their families. You know, as many of us are aware, there's, you know, very little running water or electricity in the Navajo Nation. So the fact that, you know, a grandmother or grandfather will be given a quilt, it sometimes can be a matter of life and death. I mean, they need these blankets and these quilts to stay warm during the winter. So when we are lucky enough to get a donation of finished quilts, you know, I know Susan, you know, hand picks each one, hand delivers each one to people that are in great need. And this has been something, I think, Susan, that you've really, you know, set your mind to, and you've made it it's a very, I think, it's a very important part of our project when we receive finished quilts, because then it goes directly into the hands of someone that's in great need. And that's a part that Susan's really brought to the project. That's something that, you know, kind of evolved over the years.
Wow.
Quilters, you know, they're so generous. And I know that, you know, we've all got these huge stashes, but for quilters to actually send in quilts to us, it's even more meaningful.
Thank you
You
so
guys
much.
for meeting with us and all the good that you're doing. It was personal to me, and I'm so glad that you guys came on with us, and just thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.